How do you build a high-performing culture? This is Culture Architects. Candid conversations with extraordinary leaders sharing their biggest successes, failures, and lessons learned on their culture journeys. Here's David J. Friedman.
Welcome back to my conversation with Andy Busser, CEO at Pitcairn. In the previous episode, Andy shared how he balances the century-old culture at Pitcairn with his own vision for the firm's future, and how the Pitcairn culture is informed substantially by Danny Meyer's concept of 51%er behavior. Today, we're going to get into the day-to-day practice of building and reinforcing that culture at Pitcairn, and we're also going to learn about the important cultural questions around the firm's historic first-ever acquisition of Brightside Partners. Roughly how many people work at Pitcairn?
About 85.
Okay. So it just gives people, our audience, some sense of the size and breadth of the organization. So if I were working at Pitcairn, I've come in, I've been recruited because I probably am a good fit, presumably for being a 51%er. And I see that the leadership and everybody around me is practicing these things, and this is the way they are. On a day-to-day basis, like, how do you teach this stuff to people? How does it get reinforced for people?
I think probably two ways. The sort of easy way is to write it and share it and walk through, I hate to say it, but walk through a PowerPoint presentation. But at least there's something there. You can see it's documented, it's thought out, and you can go back and reference it. But much more, it is the repetition of behavior. And David, one of the things you've done a great job is helping people differentiate between values and behaviors. And we talk about values a little bit at Pitcairn. We really talk about behaviors. We really talk about those 5 behaviors. And the way it gets reinforced, it absolutely starts with me. So when I speak, I am self-aware enough to know that people are, in our firm at least, are generally listening. And so the way I talk, the way I behave, the way I react in a situation, it all leaves an impression on people. And so I try to be very cognizant of that. And I try to create an environment where people feel they can be warm optimists. They can be really curious. They can dig in and help solve a problem, and that they feel accountable to deliver excellent work product. And so I think it very much comes back to the leadership and the repetition and behavior of the leadership.
How do these 5 behaviors or any other elements of your culture, how do they get built into, if they do, into performance evaluation reviews? I'm working in Pitcairn, I'm sitting with my manager or supervisor, and we're doing some sort of a performance review. Does that get worked in? And if so, how?
It absolutely does. So a performance review at Pitcairn, which we do annually, has 2 components. One is, how are you doing on each of the 5 behaviors? And the second piece is, did you achieve your 3 or 4 goals for the year? And I say 3 or 4. Some people like to have 20 goals for the year. Our view is if you have 20 goals for the year, you're probably not going to achieve them all, or they might just be doing your job, which is expected. So we do want to give people direct feedback where they are doing well and where they have opportunities to improve. And I can tell you, in years of doing these reviews, I can think of one time where somebody pushed back and said, "That's not true. I really am an optimist." Or I can't remember what the behavior was. But we realized this person had lots of technical skill, but didn't have the culture fit that we needed. And so we parted company. But fortunately, we run a really rigorous interview process. And so the number of times we've had to part company with people is very small.
Yeah. So, I'm going to go back to those 5 behaviors for a moment in that process. They're clear, and yet to some extent, like anything, there's some degree of, I don't know if this is a word, nebulousness I don't think that's a word. Some degree to which they are nebulous.
Subjectivity.
We'll call that that's a better word. Thank you. Some degree of subjectivity. So I'm evaluating one of my team members, and I'm trying to evaluate how curious they are. Like, how do I do that? What am I looking at to figure that out?
So everybody has work to do during the day. How far did you dig in on the assignment? Did you just do the surface level that was asked of you, or did you dig in more? Did you uncover something that other people hadn't uncovered? How far did you go to figure out if you could solve the problem? And I'll give you a perfect example. We were working on onboarding a new client, which for us is an enormous amount of work because there's a complicated set of accounts and structures and trust documents and other legal documents that you have to go through. And so wading into that is not a trivial matter. And we've always tried to come up with more efficient ways to do what is almost inherently an inefficient process. And so I worked with a client who, this was very fortunate. The client was a former management consultant. And so we sat down for an hour and a half one day and we just brainstormed ideas for how we could make it more efficient. And the client was super helpful. He said, well, this is great. And I'd like to go through the process myself again. And so we did. And I shared this with one of our relationship managers who was bringing on a new client, a very complex client. And I said, hey, Natalie, take a look at this and see what you think. And she said, wow, this is really helpful. Thanks. Let me think about this a little bit and how I would execute it. And she came back to me 2 days later and she'd built out an entire onboarding program and a whole sample of how it would be executed and what the outputs would look like. It was just amazing. And she'd put a lot of thought into it, and she'd gone and she'd found some tools that could help, and she'd found some AI support that would help. And she really just kept digging in and digging in. And she was super curious. And within 2 days, we'd made massive progress on something that had really kind of bedeviled us for years.
Wow.
And that kind of curiosity, everybody notices it.
Nate. So taking us in just a little bit different direction, you Pitcairn made an acquisition recently, correct?
We did our first one in 102 years.
So now you've got a new trend.
Yeah.
So how did you evaluate the degree of cultural fit this acquisition would have with Pitcairn, and how did you go about integrating them into the Pitcairn way of doing things?
So we are a financial services firm, so we try to be as objective as we can on as many things as possible, knowing that every human being is an emotional creature. But we laid out a list of criteria for ourselves, and we met with the team a couple of times. And then all of us on the leadership team evaluated our interactions along these 6 criteria that we'd come up with. But we really just talked about them a lot. Do we think they are 51%ers? Do we think they are warm optimists and deeply curious? Do we think they would be great culture carriers within Pitcairn? And our initial assessment was probably. And then we spent a half day with the acquisition leadership team, and then we had dinner afterwards. And we just had great conversations. And everybody on our leadership team after the dinner said, wow, I had so many interesting conversations with them tonight. Wouldn't it be great to work with them? And so then we dug into, all right, is this a good strategic fit? Can we make it a good financial fit? Are there additive skills that they can bring to us? But it really started with the culture and how do we just feel? How do we feel about working with them?
You know, what's interesting to me as I listen to you say that is that there are some, and I'm not in this camp, who would, think of the right word I want to use, would suggest at least that one should be much more analytic or objective about what you're describing as feel with a candidate, whether it's a team member candidate or an acquisition target candidate. And I, for one, and I'm not saying this is the right or wrong way, but it's just been my own style and history, I've always been a little bit more like the way you do it, like you described that. And, you know, when we've interviewed people, I just find people that I like and I hit it off with, and I have a pretty good sense of they seem like our kind of people and they'd be a good fit. And we haven't been all that objective about it in that way. And we've always been successful at doing it. And I've been the same way in other relationships, that I pretty quickly get a sense of, I feel comfortable with these people. I trust these people. They seem aligned with the way that I think about things, or not, without necessarily needing some instrument per se to, pass them through some matrix where we've got 73 questions and they have to score in a certain kind of way and dig deeper, or put them through some psychoanalysis or something. Not that all those things are wrong, but it's never been my style. And I find it interesting to hear you describe that fairly informal, in-depth, no less, but still informal way of evaluating on the fit side. I understand that you did a much more objective and rigorous evaluation on the financial and strategic part, but on the fit part, that sounds, as I hear you, to be pretty informal, even if it was in depth.
Yeah. It's a great thing. I think there's a paradox here worth talking about for a minute. There is a perception that if you can quantify things, they're objective.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
But I would argue that our process is the most objective we can come up with, because we're being honest with ourselves about whether these are going to be good people to work with, whether we're going to be able to solve problems together, and whether we're going to be able to create value together long term. And I think back, if you look at pretty much any study on value creation in mergers and acquisitions, almost every study tells you about 80% of the time, mergers and acquisitions fail to create any value. And probably about 50% of the time, they detract value from the value that was there before in the two organizations. And we see this all the time. There's a big big merger that's breaking up right now between Discovery and Time Warner, and they're just saying we couldn't create all this value. And you say, well, how did that happen? Because there's billions of dollars at stake here. And the answer is, you can make any deal look good in Excel and PowerPoint. You can come up with a great sales pitch. You can come up with all the synergies in the world. You can make numbers sing off a page. But if the people don't work well together, none of those things are going to happen. And so if you start from a culture perspective, then you can figure out whether the financial and strategic pieces are going to work. If you start from the financial perspective, which is where investment bankers start, and it's where private equity firms start, the chances that you're going to have a great culture fit on top of that are, I think the evidence shows, are much lower. But it's very easy to talk yourselves into a culture fit because you think the numbers and the strategy are going to fit.
I think that's fascinating. I was thinking as you're saying that if you've figured out the financial and the strategic fit, you could easily be seduced into convincing yourself that, we could make this work really well. I mean, look at the numbers. I hadn't really thought of it quite that way, but it's fascinating. If you started with the people part first, before you even go to the numbers, you might come up with a very different answer. That's fascinating. There's a quote that I've heard before, I've shared it often, that I've heard attributed to Albert Einstein. I don't know if he really said it or not, but sometimes quotes get attributed to people that they never really said. But it's a good quote anyway, and it relates to what you're just describing. And the quote is, "Not everything that counts can be counted, and not everything that can be counted counts." And I think there's a lot of wisdom to that, and it goes a lot to what you're saying, that sometimes there are things we can't measure and we can't put a number on it. And that doesn't mean they're not important. And I often say, and I know you're the same way, I have a bias toward wanting to measure things and thinking that's generally good, but I don't have a point of view that says, hey, if you can't put a number on it, it's not real. No, this stuff's real. It's really real. And it's really important. And the fact that we can't put a number on it, that doesn't mean it's not important or it's not critical. In fact, to your point, it's more critical to the success of the enterprise.
Yeah. Well, there's a great psychologist who died last year, Danny Kahneman, wrote a wonderful book called Thinking Fast and Slow.
Yes.
And you've probably read it, David. It's just one of the greatest books. Anybody who's listening now, I encourage you to read that book.
I didn't even realize he had died.
He died last year.
I didn't know that.
90 years old. And I would say to everybody, I wouldn't call it a light beach read, but I would call it one of the most important books you can read. And one of the things Kahneman and his research partner, Amos Tversky, discovered is how much confirmation bias there is in our decision-making.
Yeah.
And so when we think something might be true, it's very easy to go out and find numbers that can prove it's true. And that reminds me of a great quote that's attributed to Mark Twain, which given the way it's said, I think he probably did say it, which is, it ain't what you don't know that gets you into trouble. It's what you know for sure that just ain't so. And I think a lot of times we can find numbers that back up what we want to be true without objectively standing back and asking ourselves, is that realistic? Is that likely to be true?
Yeah. So getting back to this acquisition, so you went through a process of first getting to know these people, your team feeling pretty comfortable. This is a good fit. These are our kind of people. Then you did the strategic and financial analysis and decided, all right, this makes sense. So once you brought them in, how did you go about integrating? I mean, presumably from what you just described, they were already fairly aligned conceptually or philosophically. How did you go about integrating them into the Pitcairn culture?
We spent a lot of time on integration from very early on in our discussions. So before we had a term sheet even, we had a list of things that we all wanted to integrate. And importantly, we developed it together. So we would trade drafts and would say, that reminds me of another thing we ought to put on the list. And this is another thing we ought to put on the list. And so that collaborative process early on gave us all, at Pitcairn and at Brightside, the firm we acquired, gave us all insight into what it would be like to work together. And if that process had not gone well, we probably would have all said, this isn't the right thing to do. But it did go well. And it gave us all more confidence that we could solve problems together, that we could trust each other, that they could raise their hands and say, Pitcairn, I know you're acquiring us, but we think what you're suggesting might not work, and here's why. And we welcomed that feedback. If you've probably read Pat Lencioni's book, The Advantage. And
one of my
the
favorites.
Advantage, it's so good. And just letting people raise their hands and say, I don't know if that will work. I'd like to work on an alternative plan is great. Now, the person obviously just sits there and says, that's not going to work. And they cross their arms and lean back. Well, that's not that helpful. But the people who want to lean in and find alternative solutions are really great. And so we try to create that advantage, and we really try to uncover whether that advantage exists in the other firm that we're acquiring with our grand total experience of one acquisition now.
Well, you got 100 more years to do the next one. You're on a tear.
Yeah.
So, as you look back over your career and you think about the things you've learned about building a great culture, its importance and how to do it, I imagine, and I know you're a pretty humble guy, I imagine you've made some mistakes along the way in building culture. What's one or two of the mistakes you've made and what you learned from them?
I think early on in my career, and actually longer than early on, so let's just be honest with ourselves. My desire to work with people I trust has often led me to think I could trust people I probably shouldn't have, or to trust people after they made it clear I shouldn't have. And eventually I learned my lesson, but I learned it the hard way, as people often learn lessons. And I think that's one thing that I would encourage everybody to do. Be as realistic with yourself as you can be about the people in your orbit. And if you have people who aren't 51%ers, they're not warm optimists, they're not problem solvers, they're not curious, they don't care about their work product, move away from them, because they're not going to change and they're not going to help you be your best. I think another mistake I probably made early on in my career was thinking that people who said they wanted to help me actually wanted to help me. A lot of times they might have just wanted to get me to do some work for them. And that's fine. That's understandable. But I think it's another example of be objective with yourself first, and then be as objective as you can be about other people so that you can be your best and so you can help other people be their best.
One of the fundamentals that we teach in many of our clients, including our own company. We call it assume positive intent. Go into interactions assuming that most people are good people and they're fair and they're honest and they want to do the right thing and they're trustworthy. But I always say when I teach that to people, that's the starting point. That doesn't mean, to your point, if they prove themselves over and over again to be not trustworthy and you keep trusting them, that's actually stupid.
Yeah, that's on you helpful. At that point.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. But I don't know you yet. I'm going into this interaction assuming that you're probably a good person and you're probably trustworthy instead of assuming the opposite, which goes back to being, an optimistic person generally looks at the world as most people are good people.
Yeah,
but
which is true.
Yes, I think so. Yeah. But we do have to, and we do have to then use real life experiences to either confirm that continues to be true or to let go of that point of view if it's not. Yeah. So, one of the questions I'm always curious about with people, and it's a little related to what I just asked you, but slightly different, is I think about as we go through our careers, we collect, hopefully, if we're thoughtful and introspective and reflective, we collect some degree of wisdom over time as we get older, hopefully. And I'm not saying you're old, but as we get older, and
you're
we
the
have
one
more,
who doesn't think that.
I know. As we get more experience, we'll call it that. I often think that there are things we think today that we didn't used to think when we were a lot younger, and I'm curious if you were to talk to the Andy Busser who was 22 or 25 or 28 and you're early in your career, and you were giving that Andy some advice based on the Andy of today and the wisdom you've collected, what would you share with that younger version of Andy that, maybe you thought some things then that you now realize, no, that's not really a helpful way to look at things?
I was not a great student in most of my life, and probably a function of ADHD and probably 5 other, who knows. But I was not a great student. Okay. And so I was always cautious about asking questions because I thought people think, well, I'm stupid, that I should know the answer, but I don't. And what I've realized in the course of my career is every time I've asked a question where I've built up the courage to ask a question that I thought was dumb, half the room is thinking, oh, thank God he asked that question. I had no idea what this person was talking about. And I really got that courage from a mentor many years ago when I was in management consulting. And he was the leader of the firm and a brilliant guy, very successful. And a speaker was in talking with us about how they were going to use data mining to help us identify trends in businesses and other things. And he's just going on for 15 or 20 minutes. And the founder of our firm, he raised his hand. He said, "What's data mining?" And everybody around the table wanted to ask this question.
Yes.
And he had the courage to do it. And it made such an impression on me. And I just never forget that experience in 1998. Thank you, John Wilkerson, for that courage. And so it gave me a lot of courage to ask way more questions as I've gone on in life. And one of the things I do in meetings all the time, even meetings with the whole company, is I start out by encouraging people to ask questions, and don't hesitate to stop, and especially don't hesitate to ask that question that you think is a dumb question, because if you're thinking it, I guarantee half the people around the room are thinking it, and they're going to be super grateful for your courage to ask it. And the first couple times I did that with the whole firm, most people still didn't want to ask a question. They don't. I mean, who wants to ask a question that might be embarrassing in front of all their peers, the whole firm? And then we had a big all company town hall. We were launching a strategic plan. We were explaining who we're going after and how we're going to grow and so on. And I did the same thing I always do. I encourage people to ask questions. And I got to the second slide, and a guy on our operations team, Kyle, he raised his hand right away. He said, "What are you talking about?" And everybody in the firm wanted to know. And it set off a chain reaction throughout the firm where people all over the firm just stopped to ask questions all the way through. And we ended up having a fabulous discussion across the firm about a strategic plan where I think in most firms or in most cultures, you wouldn't do that. You wouldn't stop the CEO while he's in the middle of laying out the strategic plan. You'd just sit there and listen, and you'd make notes, and then you'd think about what you're going to make for dinner, and you'd think about taking the kid to the doctor's appointment. But you just get so much more engagement from people when you create an expectation of being curious and asking questions. So this is the long-winded answer to your question. I would tell a young Andy Busser, raise your hand and ask more questions.
There's just two comments about that that stick in my mind as I listen to what you're saying. One is, I just read something literally yesterday. It was a post by Daniel Pink, who I think is great. And he had posted something on LinkedIn about this. And he made a really interesting suggestion, I thought, to encourage that kind of questioning. So you're the CEO and you say to people, okay, if you have a question, just raise your hand. And yet still a lot of people don't. And he talked about some simple ways of making it more comfortable for people to do so. So one of the examples he said is, if you say to your people, I know what I just said is probably really confusing to a lot of you. All right, who's got a question about that? Like, if you say, I know it's all really confusing, you're sort of legitimizing their confusion. So it helps to diminish the likelihood that they may feel I'm the only one who's confused by this. I know most of you are probably confused by what I just said. So go ahead, ask what you want to know. So just a little thing like that can make it even a safer environment for people to speak up with those questions. I thought that was an interesting suggestion. The other thing that I was thinking about as you were describing that is that you mentioned you're a Lencioni fan. Did you ever read his book, Getting Naked?
No.
Oh, you would love that book.
Sounds great.
I know. So getting, most of his books, other than The Advantage, are written in a 1-minute manager series style he tells a fable, and through that fable format, he teaches his lesson. So he wrote a book a number of years ago called Getting Naked, and it's a story of a consultant. So it's consulting firms. And the metaphor for getting naked is, he observes that, and I know you found this and I found this, that the more willing you are to be vulnerable especially in a client situation, and that's his metaphor for being naked, when you say to a client, I don't know what you meant by that. Like, there's this part of your ego where the client's explaining something and you're feeling like, I'm supposed to be the expert here. I don't want to look like an idiot, like I don't know what I'm doing. So I'll just pretend I know what I'm talking about, or I'll just nod my head. But when you're willing to get naked and say, I'm sorry, I didn't understand what you meant by that. Could you explain that? You build trust and you build credibility. And so your willingness to say, I don't know, I'm confused, or I don't know the answer to that, let me go find out. That's his metaphor for getting naked, is your willingness to be that vulnerable in a sort of paradoxical way. It builds trust and credibility with people when you're more vulnerable.
Yeah, big time. I think we talk about that all the time. I don't know is one of the most powerful answers you can give in any setting, because first, you're not getting yourself into trouble by pretending you do know.
Yes.
And second, as you said, you're building credibility, and it gives you an opportunity to follow up with somebody and make their day down the road.
Yes, absolutely. You would like that book. You should check that one out.
Yeah, I will.
Well, Andy, this has been a fascinating conversation. I love talking culture with you. I know we're both big, passionate fans of culture, and it's great to hear the real experience you've had at Pitcairn, the things you're continuing to do. Love hearing that. I appreciate you so much for being on our podcast and sharing with our audience. You are a true culture architect.
Yeah, well, I really appreciate the opportunity and always enjoy talking with you, David.
Thank you. And that's it for today's episode of Culture Architects with Andy Busser, the CEO at Pitcairn. Folks, if you've been enjoying what we do on this show, make sure you subscribe on your preferred platform, and that way you'll automatically get updates on all my latest episodes. And if you have a minute, I'd love it if you'd leave us a review, and that way more culture fans like you can discover the show. And lastly, if you want to learn more about building a high-performance culture in your team or organization, check us out at CultureWise.com. See you next time on Culture Architects.
This has been Culture Architects with David J. Friedman. Join us next time for more insights and wisdom from great leaders in all walks of life. To book David for your next event, or to learn more about his writing, speaking, or consulting, Go to davidjfriedman.com. Culture Architects with David J. Friedman is a production of CultureWise.